I think we can call that an expectant hush. Can I introduce myself first? My name is Pip Nicholson. I'm the Dean of the Melbourne Law School, and it's an extraordinary pleasure to welcome you all here tonight. For those of you who've travelled, thank you very much for doing so. Can we start by recognising that we meet this evening on the land of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation and pay our respects to their elders, past and present. The final formality before I sit down is to introduce to you Alan Myers, the Chancellor of the University of Melbourne, who is going to officially kick off proceedings for this evening. Welcome, Alan.
Thank you very much, Pip. Ladies and gentlemen, on behalf of the University of Melbourne and the Menzies Foundation, I welcome you warmly here tonight for the first of what's described as a new generation of Menzies Orations. The Menzies Oration has been part of the University of Melbourne's calendar for about 30 years. But this Menzies Oration, unlike in the past, is not focused on higher education. The university has expanded our long and fruitful association with the Menzies Foundation by extending the scope of the presentations as part of that to include subject matter aligned with the Foundation's broader objectives, which now include Australia's response to complex global legal issues. This year's oration concerns the growing global issue of cybersecurity as one of the key challenges created by emerging technologies. This evening's speaker will address the causes, legal implications, challenges, and solutions relevant to cybersecurity at a global level. Professor David Johnson is a professor of practice at Arizona State University's School for the Future of Innovation in Society, and is a futurist and a fellow at Frost & Sullivan, an innovation company. Professor Johnson has contributed to publications as diverse as the Wall Street Journal, Slate, and Wired magazine. He was appointed the first futurist at Intel in 2009, where he worked for over a decade. He regularly appears on the BBC, Bloomberg Television, the public broadcasting system in the United States, Fox News, the Discovery Channel, and has been featured in Scientific American, the Technology Review, Forbes, Inc., and Popular Science. Please join me in welcoming Professor Brian David Johnson to the stage. I couldn't see you over there.
It's all right. Well, thank you so much, and thank you so much for that introduction. I do want to thank my hosts here from the University of Melbourne, Mr. Alan Myers, the Chancellor, Professor Duncan Marshall, Vice Chancellor, and Professor Pip Nicholson, the Dean of the School of Law. Thank you so much. I also want to extend my thank you to the Chair of the Menzies Foundation, Peter Joplin, to say thank you so much for having me. It is a pleasure to be here and a pleasure to be in Australia. I have done a lot of work in Australia over the years in my career, and when I come back, I'm always excited by the fact because I'm always reminded of how much I love rugby and how much rugby I get to watch. And then I was reminded yesterday by a native who said, well, which type of rugby? There's two. There's a right one and a wrong one. Which I replied, I've been here long enough to know you never argue with an Australian rugby fan. So we just left it at that. So what I want to do today is actually talk to you about some work that we've been doing with the Menzies Foundation, sort of thinking about the future and the future of the law and security and risk and what that might look like. But I wanted to give you a bit of an introduction to myself first. I'm also going to set my timer because I want to make sure we all stay on time. I am a futurist. I work with organizations to look 10 years out into the future And then as an applied futurist, I turn around and look backwards and say, what are the steps they need to take today, tomorrow, 5 years from now to move towards that positive future and away from the negative future? As I mentioned in my intro, I was the chief futurist at the Intel Corporation. I would help design microprocessors 10 years in the future. I'm an engineer and a designer by training. You'll see I'm a very pragmatic sort of futurist in that way. I'm also a professor at Arizona State University where I have a threat casting lab. And the threat casting lab is as it sounds. We look 10 years out into the future. We use a mix of social science, technical research, we use cultural history, we use economic data, we use global interviews and trends to model possible and probable threats 10 years out into the future to national security, global security, economic security. And then we figure out, well, what do we need to do to disrupt, mitigate, and recover from those threats? Now, I want to pause before we get into the meat of my oration to remind you that I am an optimist. I am an optimist. We're going to be talking about some very dark things. I am an optimist because over the last 25 years, as I've done this as a futurist, what I have learned is that the future is built by people. The future isn't some fixed thing over there on the horizon that we're all helpless to do anything about as we run towards it. The future is built every day by the actions of people, by organizations, by universities, communities, governments. The future is built by people. And so for me, I feel very optimistic about the future, and that's a decision. Optimism and pessimism is a decision. I am optimistic about the future because I know the future is built by people, so we should get together and build a great future, not sit back and be passive and let the future happen to us. So that's where with this work, with threat casting and the work that we do, the idea is to say, let's go 10 years out, let's look at these possible threats so that we can begin to prepare for them. And this is the work that we've been doing with the Menzies Foundation and work that we've been doing over the last few months, and we will continue to do. We have been conducting subject matter expert interviews. We have been conducting workshops, both with industry experts as well as the public, looking at this threat landscape. The threat landscape that looks at the future of security and risk and the law, but more specifically in an atmosphere of transnational threats and disputes that live in a time of uncertainty and complexity that is being amplified by the rate of technological change. So this is what we set for us and the work that we've been doing. And I can tell you, as we've gone through and had these conversations, we've started to come out with some results. Now, ultimately, we will have a report that will come out before the end of the year, and we will present it to everybody, where we'll get very pragmatic. We'll look at different areas and say, okay, what steps can we take? In my lab and in the work that I do as a futurist, I mentioned I'm an applied futurist. What I'm always trying to do is to say, not only what are these futures and how do we disrupt, mitigate, and recover, but who can play what role? What role does government play? What role does the military play? What role does industry play? What role should academia play? Should foundations and nonprofits, as well as just average folks? And so ultimately, that's my job as an applied futurist, is to say what threats are coming that are possible and probable, and what do we start doing today to get ready for them? So what we've done is we've done these interviews, we've brought some work that I've done, and so what I wanted to talk to you about tonight is to give you some of the initial results. The first thing that we've seen is that over the next 10 years, we will have a constellation of technologies that will be coming into our lives. Very specifically, we will begin to see things like artificial intelligence. We will see the Internet of Things, the ability to put computational power in any device. We'll see smart cities, which is the macro side of the Internet of Things. We will see autonomy in land, sea, and air. Certainly, we'll see distributed computational intelligence as long as a spread across a 5G network. We'll certainly have robotics. You'll have all of these different technologies coming together, and it's not just a single technology, it's all of these technologies put together, mean that over the next 10 years, we will see a threat landscape that will have what we have termed a widening attack plane. That means you will have the ability for state actors, for criminals, for people to actually make attacks, break laws. We will be able to find disputes, and it will be ever increasing because there will be ever more instances and places where it can be happen. And so as we look at this widening attack plane, we begin to see that we'll not only have just cyber attacks or digital attacks. Certainly we've seen those already, but we're going to have cyber social attacks. This is some of the work that we've done in the lab where we've seen the effect of disinformation, misinformation, and malinformation when paired with artificial intelligence and machine learning to actually target individuals, to look at their social media footprint, to look at their data footprint in this widening attack plane, to actually take this information disorder and actually go after individuals, but to do it at scale. So we will not only see cyber attacks and cyber social attacks, but if you think about this landscape of the Internet of Things, these things, as well as smart cities, we'll also begin to see cyber physical attacks. Even specifically as we look at a complex automated supply chain, this is where the digital and the physical begin to overlap, and begin to overlap in ways that are quite different than we've seen before. And then finally, we will not only have the cyber social and the cyber physical, but we'll also begin to see cyber kinetic attacks. An example of this is in February, my lab at Arizona State University is going to be looking at what is the future of digital weapons of mass destruction? And what does a weapon of mass destruction look like when it's aided by cyber? So this is again where I remind you, I'm an optimist. I tell you this because this has happened. It actually happened in one of the workshops that we did here. But I have had in my lab, I have had hardened generals in the middle of some of our conversations pause and go, BDJ, can we just take a moment? I just need some fresh air. I'm feeling pretty dark right now. So I said, no, sir and ma'am, just go with us, because the whole point of this, the whole point of looking at these areas is so that we can figure out how to empower people to go make change in those areas. So in this work that we've done, looking at this landscape of risk and security and the law and looking 10 years out, certainly we've seen this widening attack plane. So there's a multi-dimensional attack surface. We also are going to see the rise of corporations, the continued rise of corporations in a really interesting way. This entire attack plane, certainly more and more, is going to run on the backs of technologies and infrastructure that are built by private corporations. Private multinational corporations that act and interact and react in very different ways and that are regulated in different ways, in ways that we're just coming to grips with and what that might look like. Also, one of the things that I've called out quite a lot is this role of the corporation, especially of the multinational corporation. What role do they play in security? I think over the last 4 to 5 years, we're beginning to see that, especially in the world that I come from in Silicon Valley, that you're becoming to see this time where there's a very different reality when it comes to security and high tech. And it's something that we're still working out. And then finally, in this landscape of complexity and uncertainty, one of the things as well, especially in Australia and in the region, as we start looking at borders in different countries and different regulations and different types of compliance, how do we manage that? How do we manage compliance as we move from border to border and border? How do we work in a way to make sure that the region stays safe? And that this complexity means that some people may not have the budget, may not have the means to be able to do enforcement or regulation. And how is that managed by other players? So in all of this, we begin to see more and more complexity. And in this complexity, the question that I asked myself and that we asked in this work that we've done is, so in this landscape, in this threat landscape, what is the role of law? What is the role of the future of law? What does law need to do to help disrupt, mitigate, and recover from all these threats, from these potential threats? Whether they be from state actors, non-state actors, terrorists, criminals, what do we need to do? And the thing that was a finding that came out just a few days ago, it's actually just still handwritten in my notes as we've been talking, is we've been looking into a framework to say, how can we understand this? And the fact of the matter is law has a very small part to play. Incredibly small. Necessary, but not sufficient. Not sufficient to be able to go and take advantage and be able to disrupt, mitigate, and recover. Now, it's specific and it's needed. As you begin to, if you could think about it as concentric circles, so at the center of it you have sort of law and the rule of law, and then as you go a little bit wider, there's regulation, a little bit more gray area, sort of, okay, what does that look like? How do we inform that? And then as we go a little bit further out, we have norms. And this is one of the things I did a lot of talking about as I've been going around talking with folks, is sort of understanding the role of norms. Norms I find are incredibly powerful to be able to go and actually get industries, get groups of people to actually say, well, no, this is how we do business, and this is how we want to do business, and this is how we will regulate ourselves. So how do we use norms and to set those norms to actually be able to, when you're talking about across borders, actually be able to make change? I think norms are incredibly powerful. Now, the next part out, which is even wider than that, is collaboration. And this, I think, is really specific to Australia and the region, is to start thinking about how do we start collaborating better. Certainly, it was at the cyber conference yesterday where you begin to see public and private entities beginning to collaborate with each other. But how do we make sure that we begin to collaborate even more widely in that collaboration, especially when we're starting to think about the role of corporations? What does that look like? And then also in that collaboration, there's roles that need to be played. And I think when you think about that academia has a very, very large role to play. And myself as a professor and as a researcher, I begin to see that. So as we start looking at these challenges to the law, looking 10 years out, there's a lot of things we don't know. What does it actually mean? Now again, that's not my background. I can't tell you that. But what I can tell you is that since around 2015, 2016, I've been working with legal scholars at ASU, starting to think about, well, how could we use this threat casting? How could we use this idea of looking 10 years out to say, are there ways that we could think about possible threats and then start to prepare today? A perfect example is how could we think about contracts? How could we say we're going to be creating a contract today, but we know that this contract is going to go for 1, 2, 5, 10 years, and we know that the technology landscape is going to be radically different 10 years from now. Is there a way that we can build the hooks into that contract, into the approach to that? We ended up writing a paper on it, and we tried to give it a little bit of a salacious title, so it's called Dark Future Precedents. I heard one legal geek laugh. That's great. Thank you for at least laughing. Yeah, the idea of future precedents that I think when we go and we talk to professors, and I talk to the professors that I work with, I say, we need to make sure we're training the lawyers and the law professionals of tomorrow. We need to make sure we're training them to be ready for 5, 10 years from now. And this one professor that I was working with kind of giggled and said, wait a minute. So you want me to train my students in the law thinking 5 or 10 years out? I said, yeah, I think it's really important. He goes, we're training them for 10 years in the past, right? And I was like, really? That's what you're doing? And he started explaining precedent to me, and I was like, oh, wow. And we started getting into this thing, well, how could we do it? I said, well, we can give this model. This is what threat casting does. Can we start thinking it through? And this is one of the projects that we've been working on, and it's one of the things in this project that I want to kind of follow up with as I come. So I know many of you could help with that. I would love to have that conversation to say, how do we sort of take this understanding of threats and start to prepare? Now, in one of the subject matter expert interviews I did, getting specific about the training of our next generation of lawyers, one of the things this person said to me, which gave me complete pause, I said, okay, so we know we need to collaborate better, and we know in academia we need to collaborate better so that we're training the next generation so that they can go out and actually guard against these threats. And I said, what would you like the next generation of lawyers to learn? And he said to me, BDJ, I want the next generation of lawyers to know how the internet works. I want them to know what an app is and how an app actually works. That there's a level of knowledge, a baseline knowledge, that as we enter this widening attack plane of this world, that there's work that could be done there. And I'm kind of fascinated by that, because from my world and what I do as an engineer, of course, this is what we talk about all the time. And this is where I get into that collaboration, where you have somebody who says, this is what we need. I need the next generation of lawyers to have this technical expertise as they're coming out. Do they? So these, I think, are one of the areas that becomes kind of incredibly important, and for me, very, very interesting as we're thinking about this future of risk and security and the law, to say, okay, here's some very specific things that we could do. And so also in this framework, it continues to build. So you have law, and then you have regulation, and how do we make sure we're informing regulation so that as we make laws and we make regulations, we're not making them for today or tomorrow, but we're also making sure that when they get instituted or they start to grow, that we are looking 2 years out, 5 years out. What does that look like? How do we make sure for regulators and for lawmakers that we're giving them enough information to be able to actually make it work 10 years from now? As a person who models the future, that makes me very excited, because also it allows us to be able to create the mechanisms all along the way to make sure that we're doing the right thing. So we have law, we have regulation, we have norms, we have this immense amount of collaboration that needs to happen. And this is collaboration across domains, but it's also collaboration across borders. Now, the part that I'm really excited about is the biggest circle, which is culture. So culture, of course, is incredibly messy. Culture is the thing we are all kind of floating in, right? It's the thing around us. And as we start to prepare for the future of these threats, how can we create a culture that helps people prepare? Just average folks as well. And our culture takes a long time. Culture takes many, many years, and it's very messy, and it's having lots of conversations. This is one of the things that I do as a part of my lab and as a part of this threat work, and I would like to do as a part of this threat work, is to actually go and talk to average citizens to say, what are you worried about? This is one of the things when I first started collaborating with the Menzies Foundation was to say, well, let's do a threat casting with just average folks. Not folks who are in the law, not folks who are security professionals, but just average folks. And it's something I want to continue to do. I want to continue to kind of go out and think about what that might look like. And then specifically to also then, as we're doing that, to bring in other arms, not only when it comes to the law profession or when it comes to academia, but how do we make sure that we're reaching out to the military? How do we talk to the defense colleges? How do we make sure that we're training the next generation of military leaders and leaders in this way of thinking? Because things are coming so quickly, how do we train them? So then, as we're so broad, I started thinking in this culture area, which is so messy, I started thinking about something that we saw about 3 weeks ago. So three weeks ago, I was doing a threat casting back in Tempe, Arizona, for the United States Cyber Command. And we were looking at the future of information warfare and looking at what are the threats 10 years out. And one of the questions that came up there actually came up in one of the threat castings that we were doing here in Melbourne. Is we started thinking, well, how are we preparing the next generation? Not only the next generation of lawyers, but we started realizing that the next generation of cyber professionals, the next generation of cyber warriors, the ones who will be on the front lines 10 years from now, today, they are 10. What are we doing for the 10-year-olds? How are we empowering the 10-year-olds to be prepared? Because this is their future. This is what's coming. The things that we're looking at is going to be their problem. And I don't think we're talking to the 10-year-olds. Now, I don't want to scare them. They're just 10-year-olds. But how are we enabling them? Are we enabling? Are we using our education system? Are we using our culture? Are we using our media? Are we using our schools and our parents and our communities to have this conversation? Because if we can prepare those 10-year-olds, we can certainly help prepare their parents and their friends. And that's really the point of all this work, is how are we doing this to look out, to find these possible threats, and then to make sure that we're empowering people to go and do something about it. Now, I want to remind you something as I begin to wrap up and leave you with a thought. I am an optimist. I told you at the top of this, I'm an optimist and it's a choice that I make. And it's not only that I'm an optimist because I know the future is built by people. I'm also an optimist because I know that the future is local. The future doesn't happen over there. It happens in rooms like this. I have seen the future built, and I have seen the future of Australia and the future of the region. When I sat in workshops, I've seen people actively working to make that better. My phone says, hurry up. So I've seen people do that. And that future is local, and it's built when people come into rooms like this who care and who are passionate. And so that's what I'll put to you, is I believe you showed up. You actually care about the future. You actually feel like you could actually make a change. And so that's what I'll put to you, is to say, accept that you will help to build the future. You will help to make the future more safe and secure. You can empower that next generation. And it's incredibly important because we have to start doing it so we can help them and empower them to be prepared for tomorrow. But if we're going to do it, we have to start doing that today. Thank you very much.
Let me just take a moment to explain the format. So I'm going to ask each of our panellists a question, and when I do that, I'm going to give a very brief introduction of who they are. And so I'll spare you a protracted introduction at this stage. I might also add that I guess, not being a futurist and not being a pragmatic futurist, the one thing I have in common with our fabulous speaker is optimism. And it'll be interesting to see what surfaces across the panel as we have a conversation reflecting on your wonderful presentation. Thank you for that. Can I start with Michelle Price? Michelle, you're CEO of AustCyber. You're responsible for supporting the development of a vibrant and globally competitive Australian cybersecurity sector. Based on Brian's observations and your own work, what are your reflections on the cyber security risks in our region?
That is such a great question. Thanks, Pip. Hi, everyone. Hi, right up the back there. What a great room this is. It's like getting right back to our youth, isn't it? As well as our future all in one. I loved being at uni. I did it twice. And in actually my first degree, I did do law. So the risks as they face our region. Now, let's all accept for a moment in the academic context that we find ourselves in, that we're dealing with the Indo-Pacific. There is kind of a bit of a cute little tale there that you can look up. Rory Medcalf, a colleague of ours from the ANU, loves to debate whether or not the Indo-Pacific is actually a thing. But in the Indo-Pacific, when it comes to cybersecurity, the greatest risks, as far as I'm concerned, are actually human. So we deal a lot with technology when it comes to the cybers, but actually it is all about the humans. And us humans are very, very good at being different. And one of the things that we find ourselves in an intermingled space, of course, is that we live in the next theatre of war. So actually, when you speak to a cybersecurity person, we are actually already at war. We're in a different kind of war right now. We're also in an age where we've seen huge amounts of economic opportunity come to us because of the internet and the technologies that exist around the internet. But the risks, of course, from an upside thing, but a downside side of things is that absolutely every single country that exists in our part of the world is different. We cannot take a uniform approach to our part of the world. And so the kinds of cyber risks that face Indonesia versus Papua New Guinea versus the Philippines versus Vietnam versus Japan versus China versus India, if we can go that far, that's the Indo part as well, the in to the Indo. There's a lot of risks that do face us. And when we bring it all down to one common feature, it is humans. And I talk a lot often in terms of the law around the role that Australia does have on the opportunity side of the equation, to look at how we can provide some leadership around the role of the law as it applies to cyberspace and cyber-physical contexts in our part of the world. It is why AustCyber is proud to partner with the Menzies Foundation in demonstrating that leadership. This is leadership through partnership. We don't have all of the answers, nor should we ever assume that we understand what the context of a lawyer is in the Philippines versus Vietnam versus any of the other countries. When it comes to the cyber reality, we are dealing in our own country with a situation where we are making laws that are very siloed, very bespoke, and very moment in time. I would contend that that is not how we demonstrate leadership. And I say that with my role being to grow a sector that needs to be globally competitive. But we can show leadership in this space. So the risks are significant, but the benefits are enormous if we can all collectively and collaboratively put our heads together and understand what that future could look like if we really demonstrate leadership.
Can I ask just a follow-up question? You're talking about collaboration and the leadership that might be incumbent on Australia regionally, and however you define that region. But what is it, if you were to be a little bit more specific beyond leadership and collaboration, what is it that you might be looking for an active citizen who is leading in this space?
I think from a leadership perspective, it is about being collaborative and constructive. I think that each of us in our respective professions are pretty good at being able to form a really hard brick, figure out how long it's going to take us to reach the trajectory of the target that we're trying to throw that brick at, and then we try and make sure that that brick sticks. That's part of our culture. Now, we do that, I think, from the legal profession in very, very specific ways. There's others within our community and society that aren't so sophisticated in being able to throw those bricks. But in terms of the specifics of it, we are in a situation where the cyber arms race has never happened so quickly. So is the law able to evolve itself in such a way where we understand that flexibility that BDJ talked about around the role of law versus regulation versus norms, and understanding the complexity of those interchanges when you apply it to different types of dual use, and actually for cyber, it's not dual use. It's multi-use technologies that not only are being used by criminal syndicates to deploy at us, but then get iterated on by nation states to then throw back at us, either to just make a buck, to service their other endeavours, or actually to undermine the very fabric of our democracy. And so you can actually manipulate information that sits in the law to be able to then have that as a weapon in the ones and zeros to then throw back against the institutions that we rely so heavily on. And so the demonstration of leadership, in my view, is actually understanding that tradition is super important, but actually we need to also evolve how we demonstrate traditions in a completely intermingled and very complex and dynamic space. It is a cyber-physical world now. It's not happening tomorrow or in 2 years, 5 years, 10 years. It's actually now. And we've never seen a time in our lives, we're coming up to it pretty quick where it's about to change, but we've never seen a time in our lives where we have post-World War I people still living on this planet at the same time as unborn children in the wombs of their mothers who have already had their identities stolen from them through digital means. Just let that sink in for just a moment. The role of the law in that is deep, it's broad, it's intense, but it must be agile and it must be done in incrementally slightly different ways based on context.
Okay, thank you very much. Can we now turn to Dr. Lesley Seebeck? Lesley, you're CEO of ANU's, and I promise the panel is not entirely ANU's Cyber Institute, which is focused on building cyber capability. What skills do lawyers need to engage with the cyber sector?
Okay, thank you very much, Pip. And again, thank you very much to the Menzies Foundation for arranging today's oration and BDJ for an excellent talk. I would like to start by saying everything Michelle said, but nowhere near as well as her articulate in such an articulate fashion. Michelle did a very good job about expressing the complexity of the world that we're facing at the moment. And one of the things that really comes home to me when I sit down and look at the world is, what truisms still exist. So one of the things we've lost over the last 30 years because we thought we won the Cold War is we've lost that muscle memory of the foundations of our democracy. We forgot the muscle memory of what it takes to actually lift and what it means to be an individual in this space because we thought we'd won. And what's actually happened in the meantime is we found that the things like the law and so on have been weaponized against us and used as a first-hand weapon by both governments and corporations, because we've lost all those issues around what BDJ was talking around, the norms, the culture, all the human aspects. I'd just like to reiterate Michelle's point too about it's all about people. The technology is important. Never forget that. That's how we're in the situation we are now. But even technology is a human artifact. And so we need to understand that it comes with biases. It comes with views of the world and what it means to be human in that world. And really, we want the technology that reinforces what it means to be a human, an individual in our liberal democratic society. So there's the skills that lawyers will need in the future, to me, come down to a number of things. It's about how you have those conceptual frameworks as well as enough knowledge, because knowledge will continually change, to be able to get you through, and the skills to be able to ask the right questions and to be able to synthesize information and put that forward in a meaningful context. And those skills to me sort of circulate around strategic thinking. And we can go back even to people like Clausewitz, who actually, I think, would have understood today's world probably better than we thought, because ideas such as the centre of gravity, ideas such as the role of luck and risk and fortune, which is, again, today's society, the complexity of today's society. We need skills around systems thinking. How do we actually think about how emergent outcomes arise in our society? You can look at an individual, but you couldn't tell a democracy from that point of view. How you actually translate that up, how you think about the unexpected and the unintended. Computational thinking is really important. Now, that does not mean that you necessarily need to learn to be able to program, although that's increasingly a useful skill in today's society. But it means that you need to understand what encapsulation means, recursion, those basically algorithmic properties that we now shape our day-to-day world, how that translates into outcomes. And finally, the behavioural so humanist thinking, putting people at the absolute centre. Now, I come from, some of my work in the recent years has been around things like user-centred design. But if you go and talk to, say, the Estonians about what it means to be user-centred and what we mean, we use the same words, we have very different context. So we need to actually understand what putting the person at the absolute centre of our technological systems, of our society, of our legal frameworks actually means, rather than just throwing out the words and using it ad nauseum. So those are the sort of skills and thinking mindsets that we need to have, and being able to embed that in our education from the bottom up. I often use, if I can just go one step further and say, we've been in this place before. About 100 years ago, we had to convince people that there were these invisible things that could do them harm. Viruses, bacteria, and so on. Now, every day we wash our hands. We do it as soon as your toddler can sort of get up and start looking as part of toilet training. We brush our teeth every day. We have a huge public health system around what we do. It's not perfect, but it's a damn sight better than we used to have. We need the same sort of thinking around things like cyber, so we actually have that cyber hygiene built into us every day. And it just becomes part of an everyday education, as opposed to a special subject you might do in third year. It should be something that you just do.
Can I follow up? Is it the same type of conceptual underpinning that you would need to impart to an undergraduate or postgraduate student today as a mid-career professional who might also need to be cyber ready, cyber prepared and cyber active?
Yeah. I think the world is changing at such a pace that we actually need to think of ourselves as being the forever student. Mm-hmm. Every day you do go and learn something more and you actively engage in that learning. I was told recently by one of the academics who was visiting from Singapore that the Singaporean government now has a funding available so that every Singaporean can just engage in ongoing learning. And we need to think of ourselves in those terms. So it is no longer a single stage of life. It is something that you do every day. You might think about Google's 20%. So 20% are allowed to go off and do their own projects and build different things. I think too, we need to start thinking about ourselves as being those forever students that you're continually learning. So yes, there are sort of things that you want to be able to pick up, and it's up to universities, to schools, to education system to continually push those bounds rather than saying, oh, we only take care of the learning of individuals at that particular point in life. because that's no longer the case. The world is changing at such a pace that we need to engage them on an ongoing basis and upgrade our curriculum, upgrade our own knowledge, and really challenge ourselves to do that.
Yeah, it's a great challenge to leave this particular audience. Sally, can I turn to you, and can I introduce Sally to the rest of you? Professor Sally Wheeler is the Dean of the ANU College of Law, but she wears a second hat at ANU and is also their DVC International, or PwC International. You seem to use slightly different acronyms. Sally, can I ask you a question, reflecting on Brian's insights, but also, I think, the contributions of the panellists to date? What do you think are the most pressing legal questions to be considered in building cyber resilience?
So for me, I guess a lot of this is about. You'll understand when I try and use this simile that I'm not a drinker. I think it's old wine in new skins. Is that the right way around? Okay, it means nothing to me. But what I'm trying to say is that a lot of these are old problems that we've faced before. And for me, a lot of this is about the failure of the state or states, in the sense that, you know, what we've done is we have allowed technology companies, because it suited the state to do this. We have allowed technology companies to take over large parts of our lives. In times of austerity during the GFC, it suited governments absolutely to say, oh, you know, here are services that we would quite like you to deliver. Oh, look, you've got lots of information as well. That would be very helpful for us in budgeting. That would be very helpful for us in doing certain sorts of things. And there is an upside to all of that. You know, I can see that makes service delivery bespoke, etc. But it also means that we have become much more dependent on large multinational technology companies than really it's sensible for any state to be. And then when you try and retrofit regulation, it goes back to Michelle's point that states have different ways of doing this. Technology companies are able then, just like water, to find the lowest level of regulation. So while the Singaporeans say, you know, fake news is now something that's going to be a criminal offence and is banned, in other jurisdictions we're struggling to be able to say, well, how do we explain to people what is fake news and what isn't? So from this point of view, when Brian talks about law having a very small role, I suspect that he and I might have different views on what law is. And so law for me spans the regulation outer circle. It maybe even moves into norms, and it's certainly sort of part of culture as well. But the real difficulty is, how do we persuade large technology companies that they want to be part of a public-private push on regulation? A large part of that will be self-regulation. How do we protect individual citizens? How do we prevent individual citizens from becoming excluded by algorithms from certain sorts of benefits? Disadvantaged by the way algorithms process their information, and so they all become, you know, we're all in a way net vulnerable, but some people I suspect are more net vulnerable than others. So for me, it's loss of control by the state playing catch up. That I think is the most difficult thing of all.
And is there a particular role for the academy and for the university in helping to broker that fragmentation or that divergence in responsibility that you've outlined?
I think there is. I think it's a multidisciplinary solution around what might regulation look like? What does new form regulation look like? How do we create protocols that have tractions across different sorts of cultures? What do we understand about how people as individuals interact with the internet? What do we think the digital divide looks like now, and how do we both harness for the benefit of people who need it digital services, but how do we also protect people? You know, how do we create what is essentially a new notion of trust?
Lovely, thank you. Cam, can I turn to you now? Cam Whitfield, for those of you who don't know, is Head of Digital Technology and Digital Law at PwC. He's also a senior fellow at the Melbourne Law School and teaches into our JD program. So always a pleasure to chat with you, Cam. You've done a lot of work to support the development of regulatory frameworks in ASEAN and the Pacific. What are your observations about that work and its potential?
A couple of things. When you're working in, someone mentioned it before, the diversity across the region is significant. There's always this wonderful temptation to look for regional or even donor funding support to give you structures to help in this sort of space to solve for these sort of problems. And the reality is, although they're great ideas, you end up with piles of reports and not much action, to be honest. And I find an increasing skepticism around those types of sort of organisations, not their intent, but their ability to actually undertake and perform what we expect from them. A great example is when you're trying to participate in the region and you're looking to grow capacity or capability. How can you meaningfully participate in a regional forum if you do not have the capability or the capacity to meaningfully participate? And so there's a little bit of a chicken and egg, and we've talked about it with a few of us in the audience about this in the past. So there is a risk that a little bit like climate change, we end up just going back and saying the problem is too big for us to solve and therefore we can't solve it, or we'll leave it for someone, an organisation larger and more powerful than us to solve. But it's incumbent on us as individuals, as companies within countries and countries themselves to build capacity and capability in this space.
So can I ask you a follow-up question that takes perhaps two limbs? I think BDJ, if I can call you that, and certainly some of the other panellists were talking about the fact that there's a resource deficit to some of our countries and partners in the Indo-Pacific, and a responsibility on those who are relatively resource-rich to assist. Now, you've called that out as dysfunctional, might be overstating what you said, but as at least problematic. How do we bridge that if the agencies we've traditionally used are not quite up to the implementational arm of that job?
Well, we don't give up, that's for sure. And I think that it's incumbent on probably different types of agencies to take a more active role, and they can be meaningful from both a personal perspective all the way through to a significant global or regional player. I mean, there's no reason at all a group like the Menzies Foundation, for example, can't take a leading role, or this education institution itself can't take a leading role. So just because we've looked at places like the World Bank and the IBRD and regional organisations like APEC and the like, and decided that they reach a certain point where, at least in this sort of dynamic environment, are unable to contribute any further. This doesn't mean that we can't create those sort of what I call mini and more effective forums.
And is it your perception, given the global reach of the work that you've been doing, that the appetite for collaboration is there across these other institutions that you're mentioning?
I think it is. I was listening to you earlier and I was thinking, yeah, absolutely, the threat landscape is almost beyond comprehension now. And I look at the sort of work that we're doing when we look at the threat landscape, significant. We get the questions I get asked, which is, Cameron, can I hack back? Can I, as a corporation, hack back? And if not, why not? They're hacking me. Cameron, can I share this information with my competitor? The law says I'm not supposed to be sharing. This is competitively sensitive information. But those that are attacking me, they're sharing. They're sharing in a forum which is far more agile than I belong to. So how do we kind of bridge that gap? So for me, there's a whole lot of, in order to make meaningful progress, we have to find a way to bridge those or prevent those things that are stopping us becoming more agile. And they're often caught up in our laws or often caught up in our norms. And if we can do that, I think we've got a better chance. Have we got the right tools to completely manage it. I think that's a much broader question. It's incredibly challenging. But the least we could do is recognise the extent of the threat landscape and think laterally and tangentially about solutions. And that includes participants who are able to sort of upskill capacity and capability regionally.
Okay, thanks very much. Now, at this point in the proceedings, I think I'll just ask the panel to stay where they are and invite Professor Johnson, or more commonly known as BDJ this evening, to exercise a right of reply and reflection.
Yeah, I have to stand far away from these amazing people. As I was listening, thank you all. I'm reminded of something that I tell corporations and large organizations that I'm working with, and I think it applies in this area. When you think about making real and substantial change, that when you look at how an organization or a government or anything is sort of set up, you look at the processes and procedures, you look at how business is done, the way things have always been done, and if you're trying to make change for the future, you realize that all those processes and procedures are put in place for good reason. But they have everything to do with the past and very little to do with the future. And so to change that, to make change, as each of these folks have said, you actually have to put more force to overcome that inertia. To put it in a really silly way, which now you've seen me speak, I will say, it's gonna hurt. It has to hurt. And if it hurts, it means you're doing the right thing. And I don't mean that as a defeatist. Part of as you heard me speaking, part of it is that we need to empower people. We need to empower each other. I think we need to hold ourselves accountable to each other. I mean, just the breadth and depth, the intelligence on this panel could hold each other accountable as we're moving forward to go, no, we need to do this. No, we need to change this. No, we need to change this. And I will just sum up with, I think, the final bit, if I could have you all keep this in your brain. Yes, it might hurt, but the expertise and the brilliance that is on this panel and in this room can get it done, or can at least get it started and hold each other accountable. And the final bit is what I tell every student I have when they are worried that they can't overcome a large task when it has to do with the future because the future feels too immense or too complex. And I say, I understand that. It is complex and it is intense and there's a lot of work. But if not us, then who? So that's what I'll leave you with. If you're starting to think about making this region and this world safer, if not you, then who? Thank you.
Thank you.
Ryan, on behalf of the university and the Menzies Institute and everyone present, I present you with a medal.
Oh, thank you so much.
Presented to orators as you have been. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
And thank you all very much for attending, and let's hope there's a lot of future-looking, focused conversation in the ensuing weeks, months and years. Thank you very much to the panel.